Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Greiner, your host for today's Swine podcast. And with me today is Aidan Connolly from Agritech Capital. Aidan, how are you today?
Very good, thank you.
Good. Well, Aidan, we're glad to have you on today as our speaker. Some of our audience may not be familiar with you, so would you mind giving us a little introduction about yourself?
Sure. Aidan Connolly. I live in North Carolina. Some will detect a little accent, which is not from North Carolina. So grew up in Ireland and then through a long career with Alltech, managed to travel and live in multiple countries around the world. More recently, set up my own business, Agritech Capital. We've been investing, advising, consulting, speaking on issues relating to digital technologies and other technologies in livestock. And write for Forbes, teach at 3 universities on their MBA program. Done lots of interesting stuff, particularly in the last few years. So yeah, just pretty excited by what's happening in swine production and agriculture in general.
Well, that's wonderful. I think this will be a good conversation. I think you and I originally met during your Alltech days many years ago. So this technology business that you're running now today, to me, is intriguing to hear more about, particularly what you're seeing. So let's maybe start there. We talk all the time anymore about the technology that's coming into the swine barns, but what technology do you see that's going to be really important to transform where we're at today in terms of livestock production and move down the road to the next 20 years?
Very, very, very hard to answer questions revolving around 20 years because it feels like it's changing too quickly. And you do see globally some really interesting ideas. For example, these multi-story buildings that they're building in China looks like a condo or apartment tower block full of lots of hogs. I don't know if it's going to be that. Biosecurity continues to be a big issue, but I do think labor is a real challenge. I was on a discussion run by Purdue University yesterday, and they asked what I thought were the biggest issues for the next couple of years, and my top 3 were labor, and then everything else came next. Because even if we imagine people look forward to working on hog farms, always wanted to work on hog farms, always wanted to work with hogs, that increasingly is just not the case. It is hard to get people to do the jobs. The jobs are not in areas necessarily the most attractive, particularly to people who've grown up in cities. And we are finding competition from other jobs in terms of salaries. So from my perspective, I think everything that can improve or get more from people on farms, that's attractive, specifically robotics, specifically sensors, or what they sometimes call IoT devices, cameras, another type of sensor, and all of it linked together through artificial intelligence. So the ability to take all of that information, that data, and convert it into something usable. So those sorts of technologies I see. How soon? Maybe more like 5 to 8 years. Some might say 3 years, but I think 5 is a good number. 20 years, will we still be here? Will we still be consuming meat? What will happen to, one conference started talking about humans 2.0. So, all these kind of exciting, but also scary ideas. And I think it doesn't take much. I don't know if 20 years is the right number, but it doesn't take many years into the future to see levels of transformation that are almost impossible to predict.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And you certainly hit on labor. That was where I was headed with that question in particular, was thinking about this labor and the shortage is not going to change. It's probably only going to continue to increase. You mentioned robotics, and certainly I think most of us, when we think of robotics in the pig farm in particular, we think of the power washing robots that we've heard about. Any other robotic processes that we should be thinking about that you think is on the horizon and very manageable from an employee standpoint?
Well, the major installation or application of robotics is going to be in the processing plant. Whatever we think about the labor challenges of getting people to work in a hog farm, getting to work on a processing line is 10 times more difficult. And most countries have engaged in some form of restrictions on immigration. That's not just the United States. We see the same thing with Brexit in the UK. You see the same thing in other countries. And if anything, the pandemic has just accelerated that. So for me, cutting up animals, processing of meat, handling of carcasses, all these pieces, robotics, are extremely valuable. And somebody has pointed out that the Danes had fewer problems during COVID than most of the world because they were more automated in their processing plants than we are in pretty much every other country. I think in terms of the environment of the house itself, it's a very harsh environment. We know that, but nobody else seems to believe it. Ammonia, moisture, dust, flies, potentially rodents, and of course manure and the requirement for cleaning. So all of those are just things that robots don't do well with. And I suppose we've seen robots being used for heat detection in sows, pheromone detection. We've seen it being discussed in terms of potential, as you mentioned, for cleaning, maybe even for some forms of vaccination. I'm struggling with it in reality because the cost of these robots is quite high, and the challenge that we see in our farms and our barns are fairly extreme. So I think those things are coming, maybe not as quickly as we'd like them to be, but I do see them more in terms of animal handling. So when animals are being moved from barns to the processing plant, and obviously the processing plant itself, the cost benefits are huge.
And that was one of the conversations we had just this last week was, well, we know, for example, in processing plants today, we can move pigs with an automated gate, no people around. And how can we bring that into a wean to finish barn so that we can move pigs to the trucks for load outs and so forth? And when will that happen, and where in that timeline does that fit? So I think, again, the processing plant does appear to kind of be that starting point for us to figure out how we're going to bring it into the barn. One of the challenges I've seen, and it's something that as we started with group housing and using automated feeding systems many years ago, was the disconnect between the technology and the people that had to repair that technology or manage that technology. Now, I think, obviously, I'm going to date myself here, but in that time, we've moved into more of the smartphones and technology that people do keep on themselves most times, so that some of that's a little bit less intimidating. But how do you see that connection going forward? Do you think we're still going to have that disconnect between using the technology, fixing the technology, and having it in the barn with our staff?
I think there are two principal challenges. The first one, which I think you're pointing out, is the quality of labor, the education level of labor. If we have people working on our farms, not through any fault of their own, but who don't speak English or don't read English, they're going to be challenged by systems which have been programmed and where the apps are in English. And as you mentioned, if we do need to replace a robot, we do need to repair a part, we do need to change a camera or move a sensor from one animal to another, those increasingly are higher value jobs, higher education levels required, generally going to require higher pay levels. I also think people have asked why livestock is less digitized than other parts of agriculture, and why within livestock, hog production is the last one. I mean, I think we're behind, certainly behind dairy, probably behind beef. We're certainly behind aquaculture, and we're seeing more innovation taking place in poultry. I think the genuine problem is, aside from anything else, if something breaks down with our biosecurity, with our requirement for limiting how people come on and off farms, it's extremely difficult to say to a repair person, can you make it from this farm to that farm to the other farm, when in essence you should be waiting days in between visits to avoid the potential for bringing infections. So there's a lot of very specific challenges, I think, in pig production that make it a lot more difficult to implement this technology. So I like your two comments. Firstly, I think we're going to have to get used to the idea. We're going to have to pay people more and hire people with higher levels of education. And we're going to have to also be cognizant of the fact that these types of technologies have to be capable of being repaired on the farm. I think the idea that you bring a repair person in to do it is not sustainable, is not scalable, it's not robust. We need to be finding ways for very maybe simpler technologies, but certainly that are possible to be repaired by the person themselves.
That actually leads me into the next question. When I think of maybe quote simpler technology, I think of cameras. And as we think about technology that might be readily available to producers that we can utilize, are there certain ones that come to mind that today we can implement with little to no significant education base needed to operate?
I'd say 6 to 8 commercial camera companies and at least another dozen universities that are trying camera systems to see what we can do. And what we're getting with them is very, very, very exciting. The opportunity to estimate weight in real time, feed and water intake in real time, be able to recognize diseased animals that are unthrifty or perhaps need medication, need treatment. Those are all very exciting things. The challenge at the moment is the structure of a hog barn sort of makes it difficult to put the cameras in there. Where do you put a camera over a pen with 25 pigs or 50 pigs? Do you put it over the feeder? Do you put it over the drinker? Is one camera enough? So very quickly, the hardware cost for a pig becomes quite prohibitive. And at this stage, I'm a little bit skeptical. I've certainly seen people get traction in Europe where probably the cost benefit is a little greater than in the United States. But the cost of cameras is coming down. The cost of installations are coming down. And I think that's going to be the driver. We will find this sudden moment where we will make the quantum leap, where I think we will go over that cliff and suddenly we'll have a massive opportunity for this technology. But today we're a little hamstrung by the hardware cost per pig is just quite high. If you're looking at prices or cost per pig of $3, $4, maybe even $5 a pig, you need to capture a lot from that to justify it. If we can get those costs below $1, that just opens up much, much greater opportunities. But anyway, in a long answer to your question, I think cameras are the future. I think they offer big advantages over other sensor systems, and I'm very excited by them. But today we still have this cost benefit problem.
Yeah, I think you raised up a couple of good comments, actually. One of them you sort of alluded to, too, is where we put that camera. Particularly in the U.S., our barn structure is such that the roofing or the ceiling is not allowable for us to get a full pen view relative to some other setups, right? Whether to a poultry facility or to a swine facility in the EU, for example. So, how we master that technology and work it into what we currently use in the United States can be a bit of a challenge. Same with the internet, right? We continue to still have locations that don't have access to the internet, and that's the whole goal of these cameras, of course, eventually, is to be able to get notifications on your phone that pigs are sick or whatever. But those are some immediate challenges I see from a producer's perspective. Are there any others that I'm missing that might inhibit the implementation of some of the technology that you see coming our way?
No, and those and all of the others I can think of will all be solved in time. We are moving towards edge computing, the idea that you do more of the compute at the camera level or at the barn level. If you wire it back to some form of localized internet or network, that gives the opportunity to send the alerts to the producer, who's the only one that really initially needs to know what's going on. Of course, we'd love to have more of that information come from the farm. We don't necessarily need connectivity in real time all the time, much as we'd love 5G and we'd like to be able to see that. Some of the systems I've seen in other countries, I saw in China, they're using what I can only describe as a monorail, where the camera and our sensors are moved around the barn on a continuous basis. I struggle to see that in the United States. I've lived in Brazil and France and other countries. I struggle to see it in those countries as well. I think your herdsman, your herdsperson is going to end up spending a lot of their time being a repair person, fixing things and trying to make them work. But look, in time, we all know the various forms of the laws of technology, how quickly the cost comes down, how quickly the power goes up. These things will be solved, but it is frustrating to hear people say agriculture is the least digitized industry, which it is, and realize that we face these barriers to make those leaps.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a good point. We've talked a little bit, Aidan, about some of the technologies detecting out of feed issues or monitoring weights or even identifying a sick pig. Any other portions of technology that you see coming in that can fill other gaps within our production systems?
Everything you can imagine. So clearly 60% to 65, sometimes 70% of the cost of a live hog is feed. So all of these bin sensors that are coming in, there are 3-4 companies out there working on that. Again, with the same challenge, if the bin sensor breaks down, who repairs it? How do we get the data off the farm? But if you're a very large system and you can manage the cost of feed in the field and know in real time how much feed's out there and which barns you're going to have to restock, that's immensely valuable. I think lagoon management, simple sensors on the lagoons to just keep you informed as to what's happening. Could be the physical liquid within the lagoon, but it could also be odor. It could be so, and we are seeing really interesting systems being implemented for methane capture and using that for renewable energy. I'm excited by those ideas. I like just about everything, but I'd say there are probably around 10 areas that have real applications. But the ones we've mentioned so far: sensors, cameras, the use of artificial intelligence. Those are the ones that probably bring the clearest, with robotics, bring the clearest advantages. Then I get into things like cloud computing, data analytics, blockchain. Some of those are quite enabling. And when we think about education and information, extended reality, which includes augmented reality, middle reality, virtual reality, we already see those being used. For example, at the NC State Fair, North Carolina State Fair, they use it to inform consumers about how hogs are grown and where pork comes from. And I've seen the same thing being done by McDonald's. I've seen universities using it to teach veterinarian students. So there's a lot of ways in which these technologies can open up new solutions to, well, maybe to new problems.
Yeah, I think you brought up some really interesting points, because that's what I think of when we think about all the technology going in, is the data coming out, and how while we set research trials up to better understand information, sometimes we need the bigger picture. Sometimes we need to see patterns and trends in barns to understand what's really happening at the pig level, rather than what we suspect is happening when we run a research trial. So I know we talk a lot about data overload and almost being paralyzed sometimes by the data, but I think that's where the technology excites me the most, is beyond filling the labor gap, that opportunity to really be able to see full systems as they are, rather than the bits and pieces that we get on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, entirely. And it's as much an art as a science, how to present information in a way that you can do something with it. You are a person, I imagine, who likes looking at data, who's good at looking at data, who sees the patterns and maybe even the flows and the colors within data. Many of us are not. So when you pick up your iPhone, or you pick up your Android, or you pick up your iPad, you have somebody has thought through in detail how to present information that's intuitive, that's simple, that appeals, that makes it easy to understand what to do with it. A little bit as I always thought USA Today used to tried to reduce data down to graphs that if it was more passengers, the plane got bigger. If it had more people, then it was a larger mountain of people. So things that just change the way we absorb and consume data. It's going to be critical on the farm. Too much of what I see being developed by some tech companies, including some large tech companies, is not intuitive, is not easy to understand, and it's hard to know what to do with it. But I'll challenge you on the research, just because since you said it, do we need research? Surely at some point, the goal of this should be to be able to get information from farms about what's happening with real pigs in real time, under real conditions, but the level and quality of data that allows us to do research through that rather than having to create artificially something in the university or something in a research setting to try to replicate what we see in the field and limit the numbers of variations. I just hope that, as we move forward, that becomes part of the future. Sometimes when I try to wake audiences up, I say maybe in the future we won't need veterinarians or nutritionists, but I don't really mean that. But it's a good way to get people to throw stuff at you when you're on stage.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that would get a few people stirred up a bit. I also liked your concept of talking about the images, right? So I think you bring up a good point with our technology as it goes forward, is it has to be universal, that communication piece, because our languages are going to be different. How do we communicate an image to an individual so that they understand rather than words? And so I think that's actually a really intriguing piece of that technology that I think people need to keep in mind as they develop that. It goes beyond us teaching someone on a farm how to fix a broken line or camera or so forth to also understanding what they're reading or seeing.
Absolutely. The dairy industry is a really good example. More consistent and heavier use of tech in their animals on the farm. But you can open up screens and you can see a producer who has certainly gone to college, certainly studied, but did not take up farming to be sitting in front of a laptop or in front of a screen looking at piles and piles of data. And that's what these technologies are offering. And then they're surprised when they don't succeed, when they fail. So I think many of us consume information in images better than we do in numbers. Some of us like to touch things. That's probably the next level again of how you present it. But successful startups, successful innovators, successful tech companies really provide you with screens that it's clear what the information's saying and it's clear what you need to do next. And that's worth every penny that's spent on it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think you've given us some really good information today. And so maybe give us just a few key points to wrap up there and maybe identify a couple of key pieces that you think are going to be the next thing to transform at least the swine industry.
Yeah. So I've mentioned already that there's relatively few new technologies coming through compared to other species. So I would say anybody that comes on your farm or comes into your office or you meet at a conference that's got new technology, give them a big hug and tell them that you're going to help them. And don't try to prove that they're idiots or that they don't understand swine nutrition or they don't know the difference between one amino acid and another. That's a given. They're not going to. Most of these companies you're going to meet are not coming from agricultural backgrounds. So they're going to come from a tech background and they're going to need to understand our business. And it's our job to help them make that leap, not to prove to them that they're idiots. I think if you take it a little bit further, what's out there, some great apps for managing your pig flow, some really interesting technologies for listening to the pigs to see whether they're happy or unhappy. The cameras I've mentioned already, early days, but seeing already both small and larger companies embrace them and try to install them on the farm, particularly for weight estimation, but I do see opportunities for other things. Smartphones allowing you to take cameras, store images. So all of these are exciting technologies. Are they ready for prime time? Maybe not, but they're getting close, and the acceleration will come from our help. So yeah, my recommendation to everybody on this call is just give them a chance, help them make it happen. Of course, I know you do have students on listening to your podcast. You do have professors. Try to understand as much about technology as you can. You will find yourself inside of an artificial intelligence company, maybe teaching people about hogs and equally learning from their side about tech. And that's where the successful tech companies, startups for me, will come from. It'll be that mixture of people coming with practical knowledge of our industry together with people at the technology side.
Very good. Well, thank you, Aidan. As we wrap up, as you know, we may ask our audience or our guest speakers a few questions. The first one we like to ask is, do you have a swine resource that you would recommend to the listeners?
Look, I try to get my information from as many places as possible, and it is challenging, I feel, to know where to find the best information. I always liked National Hog Farmer. I always liked in the day Pig International. I like the international magazines and the US magazines, and of course most of those are available now online. So I don't have a particular one that I would say that's the only one. I have listened to this podcast and heard many other people who I've learned things from on it, and I think that's really very, very important to continue doing that. And I was very honored when you invited me to join for that reason. So I do listen to The Future of Ag with Tim Hammerich. He's got a great podcast as well that allows you to understand where technology is going in the future. And it's, to consume that or to listen to that while you're driving around the countryside, it's a great use of time, or indeed traveling in any way. More broadly, I know that the media has become very politicized, so that becomes challenging. And I am sure, as we all do, try to read all sides of an argument, try to understand what's going on. Do like The Economist. I think it still provides a great understanding of global issues and occasionally covers agriculture, I think, relatively fairly. So, but aside from that, if something appears in Wall Street Journal, New York Times, anything, I will try to make sure that I follow it and read it to see what their opinion is, even if I disagree with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Very good. How about something that's not related to swine? Is there anything that you would recommend to our audience to check out that might be helpful?
A friend of mine who still works at Alltech, Russell Gillum, he was telling me that I should read about artificial intelligence and how it's affecting consumers. And ironically, I signed myself up. I have another friend of mine who, I won't say what age he is, but he's in his 70s. And he came back from a Harvard course, an online course relating to AI, the business of artificial intelligence and how it's changing the way business is done. And the professor was teaching about applications in pigs in China. So I signed myself up for that. So I'm doing that in May. It's a 5-week course, 8 hours a week. And I hope that I will find those 8 hours and more to prepare. But I think that's an area that I think is really, really important. It's going to be the most transformational for all businesses. I actually think it's going to be more transformational for agriculture. So I think it's very important to find those things, that continuous learning. And in my case, yeah, artificial intelligence is what I want to learn more about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good recommendation. I've had a few others that have recommended some books and so forth around AI as well. And so I think taking a course, that's an excellent recommendation, not one I had considered. So
yeah, well, the AI Superpowers is a great book as well, by Kai-Fu Lee. He's Chinese, but he lives in the United States. He's a perspective on both continents and what's happening with the AI superpowers, the Googles, the Alibabas, the Tencents, Intel, etc. And although I don't love everything about it, I definitely read through Homo sapiens, Homo Deus, some of those books to think about what our future might look like, and what does the future of food consumption look like? What's the future of meat production look like? As I said, not necessarily agreeing with everything in the books, but at least it was a great way to open my mind about where we might be going next.
Right. And then that's exactly what you said earlier, was keep an open mind and review what other people are saying so that you know where we're headed. So I think those are great recommendations. The last question I have for you, Aidan, it really focuses around if you can think of someone in your life that you've identified as successful, and success can look many different ways, as we know, but what would be a key trait about them that you think has helped them to become successful?
It would be very hard for me not to mention my former boss, Piers Lyons, who set up Alltech. He created a company with no money in 1980 that became a $2.5 billion company in space of 30. He called it 35 years overnight success, or 38-year overnight success. And what was remarkable about him for me as a mentor, as a boss, I'd like to think as a friend, was that he would get himself up at 5 in the morning, 6 in the morning, go for a run. So he got oxygen into his lungs, and he was continuously learning. And I think that's the piece that I feel is most threatening and most exciting about this new area of digital tech, or indeed technology in general. You start to realize when you read about technologies, even CRISPR, the genome, the microbiome, how little we know. And we have to become continuous learners. We have to be prepared to realize that whether you have an undergraduate degree or a PhD or even a professorship, if you're not continuously learning, you're going to get left behind. You're going to be passed by others. So I saw that with him, even in the 70s. He was reading Scientific American. He was reading everything he could get his hands on. He was talking to people, trying to learn, not to say, I know it all. I don't need new ideas. I know, I have a 50-year career. Why would I need to learn more? So I think with that example, I try to follow that myself and pass it on to other younger and our older people that ask for my opinion.
Great. No, that's a wonderful characteristic to have, for sure. Always learning and being ahead of what's coming next is for sure a good thing, particularly from a business perspective as well, as it helps you be more prepared. So wonderful. Well, Aidan, I want to thank you for your time today, and for our audience again, this is Aidan Connolly from Agritech Capital. Aidan, thank you so much.
Really appreciate it, Laura. Thank you.
Imagine if, with a few key concepts, you could have the potential to create a massive positive impact by bringing from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for swine producers. Join us on this small group and go to the next level of swine nutrition on this 7-week-long elite online training in applied swine nutrition and feeding by myself and my world-class invited speakers. Additionally, you enjoy an exclusive community to exchange ideas. Go now to www.eliteswinenutritionist.com.